The forges of Mars burned with an unholy light the night the tech priests opened the vaults of Moravec. Those who had sworn loyalty to Warmaster Horus willingly pledged themselves to the Chaos Gods as the Great Crusade drew to a close, marking the birth of what would become known as the Dark Mechanicum. What had once been humanity's greatest repository of technological knowledge transformed into something infinitely more terrible. The ancient Mechanicum, keeper of sacred mysteries and builder of the Imperium's mightiest weapons, split asunder in a civil war that would echo through the millennia. This was not a simple rebellion of ambitious men seeking power. This was the corruption of an entire civilization, the perversion of faith and reason alike, orchestrated by forces that understood exactly which levers to pull to bring Mars to its knees. The story begins not with betrayal, but with resentment, festering in the hearts of those who served the machine god long before the Emperor ever set foot upon the Red Planet. When the Emperor arrived at Mars over 2 centuries before the heresy, he made promises of equal partnership in his grand crusade of conquest, but that vaunted equality never materialized in the eyes of Fabricator General Kelbor Hal. The tech priests labored endlessly in manufactorums and orbital shipyards across the galaxy, producing the weapons of war that fueled the Emperor's expansion, yet received nothing but platitudes in return. The Mechanicum had once been independent, proud, sovereign in its pursuit of knowledge. Now they found themselves reduced to mere suppliers for Terra's ambitions, their sacred quest for understanding subordinated to the Emperor's temporal concerns. Kelbor Hal was present when the Emperor first arrived on Mars, and while most of his colleagues celebrated the master of mankind, he remained deeply distrustful of the Terran warlord. He and his followers refused to see the Emperor as the avatar of the Omnissiah, viewing him instead as a false prophet who had subordinated the Mechanicum under the Imperium's heel through lies and calculated deception. The fear gnawed at them that the Emperor and his forces intended to strip away the autonomy Mars had enjoyed since the Dark Age of technology. These were not baseless concerns born of paranoia. They were rooted in cold observation of how the Treaty of Mars had slowly, inexorably transformed their civilization. The Emperor's restrictions cut deepest in matters of knowledge itself. The Emperor ordered Fabricator General Kelbor Hal to seal forbidden technologies within a special cache called the Vaults of Moravec, including devices that had been fashioned or corrupted by chaos or were inherently dangerous, such as warp-based weapons and ancient artificial general intelligences like the Men of Iron. For a culture whose entire religious philosophy centered on the pursuit of understanding, whose sacred texts proclaimed that knowledge was holy and ignorance the greatest sin, this edict represented nothing less than heresy against their deepest convictions. The Mechanicum grudgingly acquiesced, but the restraint on their search for knowledge created resentments that would fester for 2 centuries. Across Mars, in the sprawling forge cities that dominated the planet's surface, tensions mounted. Relations between the various Mechanicum Magi deteriorated into open hostility, with sporadic outbreaks of espionage and violence committed against rival forge cities. Even the mighty Titan legions, the god machines that represented the Mechanicum's greatest military power, stood under suspicion of having secretly chosen sides in an inevitable conflict. The planet had become a powder keg awaiting the spark that would ignite civil war. Beneath the surface of cooperation with Terra, Mars seethed with factional rivalry, ideological schism, and barely contained ambition. The ideological divide ran deeper than mere political disagreement. Factions on Mars had bitterly argued for years over the nature of the Omnissiah, with many believing the Emperor to be its avatar, while a large faction led by Kelbor Hal maintained the Emperor was a false idol, and the true manifestation of the Omnissiah had yet to arrive. This theological dispute represented a fundamental fracture in Mechanicum society. Those who accepted the Emperor as the Omnissiah saw in him the fulfillment of ancient prophecy, the machine god made manifest in flesh. Those who rejected this interpretation viewed the Emperor's cult as a dangerous falsehood, a perversion of their faith designed to enslave them to Terra's will. Neither side could compromise on a question so fundamental to their understanding of reality itself. Into this volatile situation came Regulus, emissary of the Warmaster Horus and architect of Mars' damnation. Regulus explained that much had changed since the Emperor's departure after the Ulanor Crusade, that new powers had emerged from the shadows offering aid to those with vision to heed them, and Horus was now assuredly a friend of the Mechanicum. The message was calculated to appeal to every grievance Kelbor Hal harboured. Horus understood what the Emperor apparently did not, that the Mechanicum deserved to be treated as equals rather than subordinates, that their quest for knowledge was sacred rather than dangerous. When the time came to strike at the Emperor, Horus would be a friend to Mars, provided the Fabricator General gave his loyalty and manufacturing capabilities to the cause of the traitors. The offer Regulus presented was seductive in its simplicity. Kel-Bahal could join forces with the traitors on condition that the autonomy of the Mechanicum be ensured, that the STC technology the sons of Horus had captured from the Orician technocracy be handed over to him, and that the Martian vaults of forbidden technology be opened for Mechanicum use. Everything Kel-Bahal desired, everything he believed the Emperor had wrongfully denied his people, Horus promised to deliver. Standard template constructs represented the holy grail of Mechanicum belief, perfect designs from humanity's golden age. Access to the Orician STCs alone would have been sufficient to tempt any tech priest. Combined with the promise of autonomy and the opening of the vaults, the offer became irresistible. But beneath the political calculations and promises of ancient technology lay something far more insidious. Playing upon the Fabricator General's resentment, greed and bitterness, Regulus convinced Kel-Bahal of Horus's resolve to support increased autonomy for the Mechanicum against the autocratic rule of the Emperor. The corruption did not begin with demons or warp spawn. It began with the oldest weapons Chaos possesses: pride, ambition, and righteous anger twisted into instruments of damnation. Kel-Bahal genuinely believed he was fighting for his people's freedom, reclaiming what had been stolen from them, restoring Mars to its rightful place as an equal power rather than a subordinate forge. Every step he took toward betrayal, he took convinced of its necessity and justice. The opening of the vaults of Moravec marked the point of no return. When the repository was reopened, there was forbidden arcane knowledge and weaponry that had been tainted by the corrupting influence of chaos, and soon the corruption spread throughout the forged cities and temples as scrap code infested the loggy stacks and cogitator archives of the Mechanicum. The Fabricator General and his allies believed they were simply accessing knowledge that should never have been forbidden. They failed to understand that some technologies were sealed not because the Emperor feared their power in loyal hands, but because the technologies themselves were alive with malign intelligence, patient and hungry for the opportunity to spread. Scrap code represents one of Chaos's most insidious weapons against the Mechanicum. It can be seen as the machine equivalent of the Dark Tongue, seemingly nonsensical at first, but possessing anarchic power that can cripple a machine spirit and pervert a piece of technology to the cause of chaos, with even knights and titans succumbing to this ravening, self-replicating scourge. Where conventional computer viruses exploit software vulnerabilities, scrap code attacks the very soul of the machine. The tech priests believed their machine spirits were simply advanced artificial intelligences, sophisticated programs requiring ritual to function properly. They did not understand or refused to accept that their machines possessed something more, something that could be corrupted just as surely as human flesh. The infection spread with terrifying speed through Mars' interconnected systems. As a result of the scrap code infestation, communication across the world and off-planet was severely disrupted, and many essential industries were sabotaged. Forged cities that had operated for millennia suddenly found their production lines producing twisted mockeries of their intended products. Servitors turned on their masters, their lobotomized brains writhing with demonic influence. Titans that had served loyally for centuries began receiving visions of carnage and glory through the manifold link. The virus was not merely destructive, it was transformative, rewriting the fundamental programming of everything it touched to serve the will of the ruinous powers. Yet not all of Mars fell immediately to the scrap code plague. Several regions remained relatively uninfected by the scrap code, insulated by their early adoption of a new, more secure digital information network technology called the Noosphere, including the forges of Coriel Zeth, Ipluvian Maximal, and Fabricator Locum Zagreus Kane. These loyalist strongholds would become the nucleus of resistance against Kel-Bahal's Dark Mechanicum, proving that Mars' fate was not yet sealed. The Noosphere represented a technological innovation that the conservative elements of the Mechanicum had resisted, viewing it as a dangerous departure from orthodox practice. Now that very innovation saved those who had adopted it, their isolation from the corrupted networks preserving both their machines and their sanity. Kel-Bahal moved swiftly to consolidate his position before opposition could organize. The Dark Mechanicum used Coriel Zeth's declaration that she no longer believed the machine god existed as pretense to declare her and her supporters Hereteks and unleash an assault against Magma City, bringing war to Mars. The irony was profound. Zeth, who remained loyal to the Emperor and Terra, was branded a heretic for her honest theological doubts. Meanwhile, Kelbor Hal, who had opened himself to demonic corruption and sworn allegiance to Chaos, claimed to defend the purity of the faith. Such inversions of truth are Chaos's signature, turning every virtue into a weapon and every honest doubt into a crime worthy of death. The schism of Mars erupted with apocalyptic fury. Later histories would record that the first blow was struck against Magos Matthias Kefra, whose forge in the Sinus Sabaeus region was housed within the Madla crater, when titans of the Legio Magna marched from the southern Noachius region and smashed down the gates of Kefra's forge within solar minutes. God machines painted in the colours of flame and death ran amok within the high walls of the crater, crushing everything beneath them in an orgy of destruction. What had been productive forges became charnel houses. Knowledge accumulated over millennia burned or was corrupted beyond recovery. The Martian Civil War would destroy more technological understanding in days than the Imperium could hope to recover in centuries. Across the planet, similar scenes of devastation played out. In the Arabian region, High Magos Ahotep's forged city in the Cassini crater was struck by 100 nuclear missiles launched from traitor silos, while along the Luni Palus and Arcadia regions, the Deathstalkers assaulted the fortress of the Deathbolts. The scale of the conflict was staggering. This was not a small insurrection that could be contained and suppressed. This was total war consuming the entire planet, splitting every institution and faction, forcing every individual to choose a side in a conflict that would determine the fate of Mars and, by extension, the entire Imperium. Those who attempted to remain neutral found neutrality an impossible position. The Dark Mechanicum tolerated no fence-sitters. The transformation of the Mechanicum into the Dark Mechanicum involved more than simple allegiance to Horus. The tech adepts of the Dark Mechanicum readily adopted black robes and wore a perversion of the Machina Opus, with the symbol of the machine god replaced by 8 arrows making the Star of Chaos, and the skull wearing a demonic grimace. These were not mere changes of uniform. They represented a fundamental reimagining of the Mechanicum's purpose and identity. Where the orthodox Mechanicum sought to preserve and understand ancient technology through careful study and reverence, the Dark Mechanicum embraced experimentation without limits, innovation without ethics, knowledge without wisdom. They convinced themselves this represented intellectual freedom rather than damnation. The philosophical transformation ran even deeper than the aesthetic changes. Horus encouraged his new allies to dabble in previously forbidden technologies, gradually enticing them to the powers of chaos. Each step seemed reasonable at the time. After all, why should certain fields of study be forbidden? Why should artificial intelligence be taboo when humanity had created such wonders in the past? Why should warp-based technologies be avoided when properly understood? The descent into heresy occurred gradually, each compromise leading naturally to the next, until the tech priests found themselves conducting rituals they would have considered abominations only months before, binding demons into machines and calling it innovation. The Dark Mechanicum's presence at the drop site massacre of Istvan Phi demonstrated their complete commitment to Horus's cause. They were present on Istvan Phi, where they used dark and forbidden knowledge against the loyalist forces. The weapons they unleashed there had been drawn from the vaults of Moravec, technology so dangerous the Emperor had ordered them sealed away. Now they were turned against his most loyal servants, used to slaughter space marines who had served the Imperium faithfully for decades. The tech priests who operated these weapons convinced themselves they were simply using superior technology to achieve a military objective. They did not yet understand that the weapons were using them, shaping their thoughts and corrupting their souls with each activation. The corruption manifested physically in ways that should have alarmed any rational observer. The adepts were quickly bestowed with mutation and other gifts of chaos. Flesh merged with metal in configurations that followed no logical design principles. Mechanical augmentations grew organic components, pulsing with unnatural life. Yet those afflicted viewed these changes not as corruption but as evolution, convinced that they were transcending the limitations of pure flesh or pure machine to achieve something greater. The line between tech priest and demon engine blurred until it became meaningless. Some Dark Mechanicum adepts could no longer distinguish where their own consciousness ended and the machine spirits they commanded began. The Dark Mechanicum's service to Horus extended beyond simple military support. During the heresy, Kelbar-Hal oversaw the construction of the Furious Abyss in the shipyards around Jupiter for the Word-Bearers, a vessel intended to destroy the Ultramarines' Legion. The Furious Abyss represented the Dark Mechanicum's philosophy made manifest, a warship of unprecedented scale built without regard for the traditional limitations imposed by Imperial doctrine. It incorporated forbidden technologies, warp-based propulsion systems, and weapon systems that violated every safety protocol the Orthodox Mechanicum held sacred. That it ultimately failed in its mission mattered less than what its construction revealed about how far Kelbar-Hal's followers had fallen. Back on Mars, the Civil War ground on with no clear victor emerging. After the schism, Mars was blockaded by the Imperial fists, and Kelbar-Hal was contained on the Red Planet for the next several years, forcing him to rely on his 9 disciples to act as his emissaries in Horus's fleets. The blockade prevented Mars from directly supporting the traitor advance, limiting the damage the Dark Mechanicum could inflict on the wider Imperium, yet it also meant the world that should have been supplying the Loyalist war effort was instead consuming its own strength in fratricidal conflict. The loss of Mars as a functioning Forge world represented perhaps the greatest strategic blow the Imperium suffered during the entire heresy, more crippling in its long-term consequences than any military defeat. The Loyalists who resisted the Dark Mechanicum's rise paid a terrible price for their defiance. The destruction wrought by the traitors on Mars and in a dozen other spheres of war was unparalleled, leaving a stain on the soul of the Omnissiah's priesthood that would never be cleansed. Forge temples that had stood for millennia were reduced to slag. Archives containing irreplaceable knowledge were corrupted or destroyed. Master tech priests who had devoted lifetimes to their arts were cut down by their former brothers. The survivors would carry the scars of those days forward, their trust forever broken, their faith permanently shadowed by the knowledge that even the most learned and pious could fall to Chaos's corruption. Among the Loyalist leaders who emerged during the schism, Zagreus Cain would prove most significant. Cain was Narcmagos, the fabricator locum of the cult Mechanicus, and forge master of Mondus Oculum, who succeeded the traitorous Kelbar-Hal as the new fabricator general of the Loyalist Mechanicum forces during the opening days of the Schism of Mars. Cain's rise represented the Orthodox Mechanicum's last hope for survival. Where Kelbar-Hal had allowed ambition and resentment to open him to corruption, Cain maintained his focus on duty and service to the Emperor. His leadership during the dark days of the Schism prevented Mars from falling entirely to chaos, preserving a nucleus of loyal tech priests who would eventually drive their corrupted brethren from the Red Planet. The transformation of the Mechanicum into 2 opposed factions represented more than a political split. It embodied fundamentally different philosophical approaches to technology and knowledge itself. The Orthodox Mechanicum, increasingly consolidated under Cain's leadership, held that technology was sacred, that ancient knowledge should be preserved and understood through careful study, that innovation must be tempered by caution and ethics. The Dark Mechanicum rejected all such limitations, viewing them as artificial constraints that prevented true understanding. They believed that all knowledge should be pursued regardless of consequences, that any tool could be used safely by those with sufficient understanding, that power itself was the ultimate measure of truth. This philosophical divide manifested in practical differences in how the 2 factions approached their craft. Where Orthodox tech priests followed elaborate rituals to maintain and operate machinery, believing these rituals essential to appease machine spirits, the Dark Mechanicum increasingly relied on raw power, forcing compliance through sorcery and demonic pacts rather than prayer and maintenance. Where loyal fabricators sought to replicate ancient STC designs as faithfully as possible, Dark Mechanicum Hereteks modified and innovated freely, creating twisted amalgamations that combined technology with warpcraft. Neither approach was entirely rational by the standards of the Dark Age of technology, but one maintained at least the form of sanity, while the other embraced madness as a virtue. The corruption of the Titan legions represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of Mars' fall. These god machines, revered as the Mechanicum's holiest weapons, split along with their parent organization. Members of the Collegia Titanica became Hereteks in service to Chaos, their titans corrupted into monstrous demon engines. The bond between Princeps and Titan had always been intimate, bordering on the spiritual. The manifold connection that allowed a Princeps to command these walking cathedrals of war also made them vulnerable to corruption. When a Titan's machine spirit fell to scrap code, its princeps often followed, their consciousness merging with demonic intelligences until they could no longer distinguish duty from damnation. The scrap code itself evolved as the schism progressed, becoming more sophisticated and targeted. Warpsmiths often oversee the implementation of scrap code, having learned this art from the teachings of the demon Primarchs Mortarion and Perturabo, and it serves as a language used by Hereteks of the Dark Mechanicum to converse and commune with the Chaos Gods and their manifestations. What had begun as a viral infection became a communication protocol, a means by which the corrupted could interface directly with entities in the warp. The Dark Mechanicum convinced themselves this represented a breakthrough in understanding, a new paradigm that united technology and psychic phenomena. They failed or refused to recognize that every conversation with these entities cost them more of their humanity. The transformation was not instantaneous or uniform. Many who eventually became part of the Dark Mechanicum began their journey convinced they were fighting for the Mechanicum's freedom and dignity. They saw themselves as reformers, as those brave enough to question dogma and seek truth wherever it might lead. Kel-Bahal genuinely believed he was restoring Mars to independence, reclaiming autonomy that the Emperor had wrongfully taken. Even as mutation racked their flesh and demons whispered in their cogitators, many Dark Mechanicum tech priests maintained they were the true believers, faithful to the machine god's actual will rather than the Emperor's corrupt interpretation. This self-deception represents one of Chaos's most effective weapons. The corrupted rarely see themselves as fallen. They view their transformation as evolution, their damnation as enlightenment. The Dark Mechanicum did not consciously choose to worship chaos in most cases. They chose knowledge over dogma, power over caution, ambition over contentment. Each choice seemed reasonable, even admirable in isolation. Only in aggregate did they constitute a path to absolute corruption, and by then the ability to turn back had long since passed. The tragedy of Mars lies not in evil men doing evil things, but in principled individuals convinced their terrible actions served a greater good. How Chaos turned the tech priests into the Dark Mechanicum. Part 2, the defeat of Horus at the Siege of Terra marked the beginning of the end for the Dark Mechanicum's ambitions to reshape the Imperium in their image. When Horus was slain by the Emperor during the epic confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the traitor forces lost their unifying figure and their strategic cohesion. The loyalist elements of the Mechanicum succeeded in driving their chaos-corrupted brethren from the Red Planet in the aftermath of the War Master's death. Mars, the sacred heart of the cult Mechanicus, would be purged of the corruption that had nearly destroyed it, though at terrible cost. The Civil War had devastated the planet's infrastructure, destroyed irreplaceable knowledge, and left scars that would never fully heal. The tech priests who survived the schism emerged hardened, suspicious, and forever changed by the revelation that their faith could be perverted so thoroughly. The Great Scouring saw Imperial forces systematically reclaim territories that had fallen to the traitors during the heresy. For the Dark Mechanicum, this meant losing access to forge worlds they had controlled, fleeing before advancing loyalist armies, watching as their hell forges were besieged or destroyed. Many of these so-called heretics fled into the Eye of Terror alongside the other traitors, seeking refuge in the realm where reality bent to the will of the Chaos Gods. Others scattered to the dark corners of the galaxy, establishing hidden forges in regions beyond Imperial reach. The Eye of Terror became their primary sanctuary, a space where the laws of physics held less sway than the whims of the ruinous powers, where their twisted experiments could continue without the constant threat of Imperial intervention. The transition from Mars to the Hellforges of the Eye represented a fundamental transformation in the Dark Mechanicum's nature. On Mars, even as corrupted traitors, they had maintained some semblance of their former organization and methodology. In the Eye of Terror, those last restraints dissolved completely. The Hellforges are wholly given over to demon machines and infernal industries, where mills grind flesh, and suffering itself becomes currency used to make the insane visions of their nightmarish masters real. These are not places where rational engineering takes place. They are nightmare factories where the boundary between the material and immaterial has ceased to exist, where machines grow organic components and flesh develops metallic properties, where the screams of the damned provide power for furnaces that burn with warp fire. The physical structure of Hellforges defies logical description. The ubiquitous holy symbol of the blessed cogwheel is gone. replaced by leering metal skulls set in circlets of spiked teeth. Forge cities rise in random fashion, lurching toward the skies and deep into the planetary crust at the whims of their dark magi lords. There is no proper logical structure to these worlds, no careful planning or efficient design. Instead, they grow according to the fevered imaginations of their masters and the chaotic influence of the warp itself. A factory might spawn new production lines overnight, equipment appearing fully formed from the substance of the immaterium. Buildings shift position, rearranging themselves like pieces on a board moved by invisible hands. The very geography becomes fluid, responding to the emotional state of the world's rulers. Countless millions are enslaved to work in a world-spanning network of labyrinthine forges, churning out an endless supply of weapons and armaments for the traitor legion's long war against the Imperium. The masters of these dark mechanicum hell-forge worlds, most now half-demonic machines themselves, have long since left the shreds of their humanity behind and are beholden to none. They sell or barter their unholy inventions and arms to the highest bidder, whether warlord, demagogue, chaos sorcerer or demon prince without favour, and their coin of exchange is always the same: new raw materials consisting of flesh and souls of slaves for their infernal forges. This represents the ultimate corruption of the Mechanicum's original purpose. Where Mars once produced weapons to defend humanity, the Hellforges produce weapons to destroy it, and they require human suffering as literal fuel. Among the Hellforges, Xarnas II stands as perhaps the most infamous. The history of Xarna II began when tech priests of the original Forge Lords of the Xarna system declared loyalty to Warmaster Horus during the Horus Heresy, and they were ultimately forced to flee into the Eye of Terror during the Great Scouring. Operated by the Dark Mechanicum, Xarna is infamous for its production of advanced wargear and demon engines for the forces of chaos. The hellish world is believed to be a planet wholly given to demon machines and infernal industries, where mills grind flesh, and countless millions are enslaved to work in its world-spanning factories. The masters of Xarna II, often half-demon machines themselves, have long since given up their humanity and answer to none. They sell their creations to the highest bidder and accept only human currency to feed their world's endless requirements for slaves and souls. Xarnas II is particularly known for its aircraft, such as the Hellblade and Helltalon, which are widely used by the forces of chaos throughout the galaxy. Another notable Hellforge was Sarum, located near the Maelstrom. During the Age of Strife, the world became an Adeptus Mechanicus station, but was soon isolated and embattled. On its own against raiders, Xenos and Abhumans without aid from Mars, the priests of Sarum became isolationists under a cult led by their ruler, Redjack. Sarum pledged itself to the forces of Horus during the Horus Heresy, and became a forge world for the Dark Mechanicum, continuing to supply the World Eaters with their armaments throughout the conflict. Toward the later stages of the heresy, Perturabo himself arrived at Sarum in search of information about where to find Angron. He found the planet corrupted beyond measure, with a solid crust of debris in orbit acting as a type of outer shell. On Sarum, the priests had become slaves to chaos, their heads replaced with the skulls of various creatures. This represented the final stage of transformation, where even the pretense of humanity had been discarded entirely. The Dark Mechanicum's most infamous contribution to the forces of chaos remains their demon engines, nightmarish artificial constructs that fuse real space vehicles or combat walkers with possessing demonic spirits of the warp. Demon engines are gigantic war machines that prowl on mighty piston-driven limbs, with gargoyle-muzzled cannons and heavy weapon arms that end in murderous tools of war jutting from their armoured torsos. To compare a demon engine to an ordinary vehicle is folly, for each of these beasts possesses its own malevolent sentience rather than a crew. Bound within the battle-scarred metal of each demon engine is the essence of a raging warp entity, imprisoned in a physically indomitable body to better serve the Chaos Space Marines in their long war against the servants of the Corpse Emperor. The creation of demon engines represents tripartite blasphemy. To bring one into being, a sorcerer, dark apostle, and warpsmith or dark mechanicum magus must come together in fell alignment. The sorcerer must utilize the forbidden dark arts to weaken the thin skein of reality, and create a portal through which a demon may be drawn forth. The dark apostle must entreat the ruinous powers and bind that denizen to his ferocious will, thus dragging it through the portal the sorcerer has created. The warpsmith or magus's role is to provide the mechanical shell into which the demon is bound, and to set the warding chains upon it so the demon does not escape. Such a process is costly in the extreme, and each step involves much shedding of the blood of innocence and the invocation of unspeakable powers. The greatest danger is to the participants themselves, for any misstep, any weakness of resolve, or any misspeaking of the ritual incantations can bring about the doom of all involved. These captive demons are dragged biting and screaming into the flame-hearted citadels of the Dark Mechanicum. In the molten heat of the dark forges, the warpsmiths trap the screaming demons within the rune-bound hulls of giant metallic beasts they have created. The screaming and newly created machine fiends must then be bludgeoned into submission until the time of battle is at hand. Caging a hate-filled demon in a physical form that can smash through a fortress wall is hazardous business. Dozens of machine thralls and many more dark adepts are lost with the creation of each demon engine, for they do not fear death or pain, but delight in bringing it to their enemies in as vicious a fashion as possible. The price is considered acceptable given the raw power these monsters provide on the battlefield. The Defiler stands among the most common demon engines, created by the Dark Mechanicum on the Forge world of Zana II at the command of Abaddon the Despoiler in preparation for the First Black Crusade. Unlike the tanks and vehicles of the Imperium operated by humans, a Defiler is controlled by a demon trapped within the rune-bound hull of the machine through complex sorcerous rites. Standing on 6 piston-driven limbs, the Defiler's hull supports a massive turret housing the main armaments of the infernal machine. The Defiler can sustain hits that would immobilize a battle tank without difficulty, as demons are immortal and unconcerned for the survival of their machine host. They ignore hits that would kill normal tank crews and continue on rampages of destruction that would otherwise be impossible. When a Defiler arrives on the battlefield, the technosorcery keeping the bound demon peaceful is released, allowing the demon to truly enjoy the battle. The Mauler Fiend represents another category of demon engine, designed by the warpsmiths of the Dark Mechanicum for close-range combat. Mauler Fiends thunder toward their foes like giant attack beasts loosed from the leash, their eyes glowing with the balefire of the warp as ectoplasmic drool drizzles down through their great fanged maws. The Mauler Fiend's primary limbs end in prehensile, clawed power fists powerful enough to tear an Astartes dreadnought limb from limb. Should a Mauler Fiend catch a squad of less protected warriors, they will scissor them apart or simply squeeze them into paste with a flex of their claws and a growl of satisfaction. Unlike the Forge Fiend powered by an internal warpfire furnace, the Mauler Fiend is powered and fueled by the rage of the demon inhabiting its shell, and this amplifies the power of its weapons. The Mauler Fiend is also known as a stalker tank or scaler to Imperial troops, as these multi-limbed monsters have the strength and agility to climb even the most sheer of walls, and no place is truly safe from them once they have caught the scent of their prey. If even a single Mauler Fiend makes it to the walls of an enemy emplacement, it will clamber across the sheer faces, tapping with its claw pincers until it finds a weak point before peeling open a large section and forcing its way inside. Due to their utility in siege warfare, Mauler Fiends are used extensively by the warpsmiths of the Iron Warriors' Traitor Legion. Even the most redoubtable Imperial defences will fall into deathly silence once a Mauler Fiend has breached the walls and set upon the fleshy morsels that lie within. The philosophical divergence between the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Dark Mechanicum crystallized in the millennia following the heresy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, traumatized by the betrayal of Kelbor Hal and the horrors of the Schism, retreated into ever more rigid orthodoxy. Innovation became suspect, experimentation dangerous. The quest for knowledge that once defined their culture was subordinated to the preservation and replication of existing SDC designs. Every ritual became more elaborate, every deviation from established procedure more heretical. They convinced themselves this conservatism was necessary to prevent another fall, that the Emperor's restrictions on forbidden knowledge had been wisdom rather than tyranny. In their fear of corruption, they created a culture that stifled the very curiosity their machine god supposedly embodied. The Dark Mechanicum took the opposite path. They rejected all limitations on knowledge, viewing such restrictions as artificial constraints that prevented true understanding. Unlike their loyal Mechanicum brethren, the Dark Mechanicus had no issue with modifying STCs or other forms of sanctioned Imperial technology. They uncovered forbidden technology from the Dark Ages such as the Silica Animus and Anima Mori without hesitation or guilt. As demonstrated with devices such as the Kaban machine, the Dark Mechanicum had little to no qualms when it came to the development of artificial intelligence. the very technology whose rebellion had nearly destroyed humanity during the Age of Strife. They convinced themselves their greater understanding meant they could control what previous generations could not, that the dangers were exaggerated, that true genius required risk. Dark Mechanicum technology became heavily intertwined with the warp and demonic entities, pushing the boundaries of genetic experimentation and advanced cybernetics beyond anything the Imperium would consider acceptable. However, of all their esoteric technologies, demon engines remain their most infamous creations. These constructs are neither fully mechanical nor fully organic, existing as terrifying hybrids of flesh, metal, and warp energy. Unlike Imperial Titans or Knight suits powered by machine spirits, demon engines are fused with demonic entities, transforming them into living war machines that possess malevolent intelligence and insatiable hunger for destruction. The Dark Mechanicum views this fusion as the ultimate synthesis of technology and warpcraft, the pinnacle of their art. They fail or refuse to recognize that each demon engine represents another victory for chaos, another instance of the material universe surrendering to the predations of the Immaterium. The relationship between the Dark Mechanicum and the Traitor Legions evolved into one of mutual dependence and mutual exploitation. The Dark Mechanicum still maintains strong ties with the Traitor Titan Legions and Chaos Knights, with Dark Tech priests maintaining ancient chaos-corrupted Titan and Knight engines in exchange for their services in war. Ever wonder how Chaos Space Marines obtain ammunition for their bolters, how they repair their armor when it becomes inevitably damaged? Who maintains the Traitor Titan Legions? It is all done by the Dark Mechanicum. Without their Hellforges, the Long War would be impossible to sustain. The Traitor Legions would run out of ammunition, their power armor would fail, their vehicles would break down. The Dark Mechanicum provides the logistical backbone that allows Chaos to remain a galactic threat millennia after their initial defeat. Yet this relationship is far from simple service. The Dark Mechanicum operates from a position of strength, aware that the Traitor Legions need them more than they need any individual warband. They sell their creations to the highest bidder, be they Chaos Space Marines, Demon Princes, Sorcerers, or Warlords, accepting only the currency that matters to them: slaves, souls, archaeotech, and the raw materials needed for their experiments. Powerful Chaos, lords such as Abaddon the Despoiler, keep them in line with the shiny hordes of archaeotech they found during the Great Crusade, trading ancient technological wonders for the Dark Mechanicum's services. This dynamic creates a strange market economy within the Eye of Terror, where power, knowledge, and suffering are traded like commodities. In opposition to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Dark Mechanicum favours exploring technology to its limits and trying to create new technology rather than merely preserving the old. Unfortunately, most of their inventions merely boil down to putting a demon in some tech and watching the resulting carnage. This often means finding better ways to create demon engines and making even weirder warp-based tech and weapons. Many members of the Dark Mechanicum who do not worship the entity Vashtor the Archifan consider the Omnissiah to be a combined aspect of Chaos Undivided, holding it as a means of progress and knowledge rather than the restricted dogma of their loyalist counterparts. They have reimagined their faith entirely, converting the machine god from a deity of order and logic into something that embraces chaos, mutation, and transformation. The Dark Mechanicum's search for forbidden knowledge has yielded results that vindicate their philosophy in their own minds. They have achieved technological breakthroughs that the hidebound Adeptus Mechanicus could never imagine. The psychosonic weapons of the Emperor's children, the gene atrocities created by Fabius Bile, the malign perversion of techno-viral technology used to create the terrible obliterators, all have been laid at the Dark Mechanicum's door. They can point to these innovations as proof that their approach works, that the pursuit of knowledge without limits yields tangible power. What they conveniently ignore is the cost, the countless lives consumed in their experiments, the demons now running loose in the galaxy because of their summonings gone awry, the corruption that spreads from every device they create. There are those servants of chaos who live beyond the normal ken of mortals within demon worlds, where the laws of nature and reason have been completely usurped by the whims of the ruinous powers. Here demons roam freely and are constantly nourished by the twisting winds of sorcery, as mortals become their playthings with value only as chaos champions or slaves. Demon worlds are a sanctuary for the worshippers of chaos with the means and courage to flee to them. The Inquisition never rests in its efforts to eliminate the devotees of the dark gods, but a demon world defies even their shadowy reach. A few demon worlds are dominated by the remnants of the dark mechanicum that once followed Horus. These represent the ultimate expression of their corruption, worlds that have been so thoroughly transformed by warp energies that they no longer follow the laws of physics at all. The ultimate fate of Kel-Bahal himself remains unknown. Following the fall of the dark mechanicum after Horus's defeat, he simply vanished from imperial records. Some believe he still resides deep within the Eye of Terror, leading the dark mechanicum from the shadows, a half-demon, half-machine horror that has long since transcended anything recognizable as human. Others speculate he was destroyed by rivals within the dark mechanicum, torn apart by ambitious subordinates seeking to claim his position. Still others whisper that he achieved apotheosis, transforming into something more akin to a demon prince of the machine than anything the mechanicum would recognize. The truth may never be known, but his legacy endures in every hellforge that churns out weapons for chaos, in every demon engine that prowls the battlefields of the galaxy. The members of the Adeptus Mechanicus hold their darkest hatred for those renegade forces of their own brethren who turned on them during the Horus heresy, traitors who live on to this day as the Dark Mechanicum. The forbidden histories of those terrible days show that the destruction wrought by the traitors on Mars and in a dozen other spheres of war was unparalleled and has left a stain on the soul of the Omnissiah's priesthood that has never been cleansed. This is not the hatred one feels for a traditional enemy. This is the revulsion one feels for a corrupted version of oneself, the horror of looking into a dark mirror and seeing what you might have become. The Adeptus Mechanicus recognizes in the Dark Mechanicum the endpoint of their own curiosity and ambition if left unchecked by faith and discipline. Yet even as they profess horror at the Dark Mechanicum's tech heresy, the Adeptus Mechanicus remains curious about what their dark brethren are accomplishing. They view the Dark Mechanicum's knowledge as a blasphemous affront to the machine god and his Omnissiah, even as they are always curious to learn more about what their dark brethren are up to. This curiosity represents one of the greatest dangers the Dark Mechanicum poses. Every tech priest who investigates them too closely risks falling into the same trap that claimed Kel-Bahal. The forbidden knowledge is seductive precisely because it works, because it produces results that orthodox methods cannot match. The line between studying the enemy to defeat them and studying the enemy to emulate them becomes increasingly blurred. In the current era of the 41st and 42nd millennia, the Dark Mechanicum remains active and dangerous. They believe the Emperor is the false Omnissiah and see themselves as the true Mechanicum, merging demon and artificial sentience in ways that produce weapons of terrifying power. They utilize massive, demonically corrupted Titan war machines of the traitor Titan legions against the Imperium and produce infernal weapons and demon engines from Hellforge worlds. Their creations appear with disturbing regularity in the arsenals of Chaos warbands throughout the galaxy. Every Black Crusade sees Dark Mechanicum involvement. Every major Chaos incursion relies on their weapons and war machines. They have become an indispensable component of the forces arrayed against the Imperium. The path of the Omnissiah has left humanity dithering in the darkness, incapable of advancing on the paths of knowledge, according to the Dark Mechanicum philosophy. Embracing the warp reveals technology that the primitives on Mars could never dream of wielding. This belief system justifies every horror they commit, every soul they damn, every abomination they create. They have convinced themselves that their pursuit of knowledge serves a greater good, that the suffering they inflict is necessary for progress, that the corruption spreading from their works is simply the price of advancement. This represents the final victory of chaos over the tech priests who fell to its lure. They no longer even recognize the evil they perpetrate, viewing it instead as necessary experimentation and innovation. The tragedy of the Dark Mechanicum lies not in their current state, but in how they arrived there. These were not inherently evil individuals. Kel-Bahal was brilliant, dedicated to his people, genuinely concerned with Mars's autonomy and the preservation of ancient knowledge. His followers shared these virtues. They believed they were fighting for something worthwhile, resisting tyranny, reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Every step toward damnation seemed justified at the time. Even now, millennia later, the Dark Mechanicum likely believes their cause was righteous, that history will vindicate their choices, that the long war will eventually prove them correct. They do not see themselves as villains of the story, but as tragic heroes fighting against impossible odds for principles they hold dear. The existence of the Dark Mechanicum serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of pride, ambition, and the pursuit of knowledge without wisdom. The Adeptus Mechanicus's rigid orthodoxy, frustrating as it may be, exists because they witnessed firsthand what happens when curiosity is unrestrained by ethics. Every prohibition, every ritual, every seeming inefficiency in their methodology has been purchased with the blood of those who died in the Schism of Mars. The tech priests of the 41st millennium maintain their conservative approach, not because they are stupid or hidebound, but because they remember what the alternative produced. They have seen the Hellforges. They have faced the demon engines. They know exactly what unrestricted experimentation yields when the experimenters have lost their moral compass. Silent in the Calixian extent are worlds from which the Omnissiah has withdrawn his blessings. They trail their parent stars like errant children struck dumb and blooded. Their ruins are profound, their catacombs endless, their savages sorrowful, for these wards of the Imperium of mankind have paid a great and terrible price for the tech heresy of their forebears. These fallen Forge worlds stand as monuments to the Dark Mechanicum's passage, reminders of what was lost when Kelbahal chose ambition over duty. The suffering of these worlds continues millennia after the Dark Mechanicum's departure, their populations twisted by residual corruption, their technology warped beyond recognition, their very geography scarred by warp energies that will never fully dissipate. The Dark Mechanicum represents more than a military threat to the Imperium. They represent a philosophical challenge to everything the Adeptus Mechanicus claims to stand for. If the pursuit of knowledge is holy, why should any knowledge be forbidden? If understanding is the highest virtue, why restrict experimentation? If innovation serves the machine god, why cling to ancient designs? These questions have no easy answers. The Adeptus Mechanicus responds by retreating into dogma, by making faith rather than reason their watchword. But doing so betrays the very principles upon which the Mechanicum was founded. The Dark Mechanicum embraced those founding principles and was damned by them. Somewhere between these extremes lies a balanced approach, but neither faction has found it. The story of how chaos turned the tech priests into the Dark Mechanicum is ultimately a story about the corruption of virtue. Curiosity became recklessness, pride became arrogance, independence became rebellion, justice became revenge. Knowledge became power without purpose. Each transformation occurred so gradually that those experiencing it barely noticed. By the time they recognized what they had become, it was far too late to turn back. The scrap code had infected not just their machines, but their souls. The demons they bound into their demon engines were reflections of the demons they had become themselves. The Hellforges they created mirrored the hell they had made of their own existence. 10,000 years after the Horus heresy, the Dark Mechanicum continues their work in the Eye of Terror and other dark corners of the galaxy. They experiment, innovate, and create without restraint or conscience. Each new demon engine, each corrupted titan, each hellblade that rolls off their production lines represents another small victory for chaos. They measure success not in lives saved or knowledge preserved, but in weapons produced and enemies destroyed. They have forgotten, if they ever knew, that technology should serve humanity rather than humanity serving technology. In their pursuit of understanding, they lost sight of why understanding matters. In their quest for freedom from restriction, they enslaved themselves to forces far more tyrannical than any emperor. The wheel of history continues to turn. New generations of tech priests on both sides never witnessed the schism of Mars firsthand. For them, the division between Adeptus Mechanicus and Dark Mechanicum is simply how things have always been. They inherit the hatred, the fear, the philosophical positions without necessarily understanding their origins. This creates the danger that the lessons learned so painfully might be forgotten. Already there are radical tech priests within the Adeptus Mechanicus who chafe at the restrictions imposed by their superiors, who wonder if perhaps Kelbahal had a point about the need for greater autonomy and freedom of experimentation. Meanwhile, within the Dark Mechanicum, there may be those who have begun to question whether the price they pay for their innovations is truly worthwhile, but such doubts, on either side, are dangerous to voice aloud. The final lesson of the Dark Mechanicum's fall is that it could happen again. The same resentments that motivated Kelbahal still exist. The Emperor's restrictions on dangerous technologies remain in force. The subordination of the Adeptus Mechanicus to the wider Imperium continues to rankle some tech priests. All the ingredients that led to the schism of Mars persist in the current era. Only the memory of how terrible the consequences were prevents another split. But memory fades with time. 10,000 years is a long time to remember. Eventually someone will make Kelbahal's choice again, convinced that this time will be different, that they are smarter or more careful or better prepared, and chaos, patient and eternal, will be waiting to welcome them into damnation. The story of how chaos turned the tech priests into the Dark Mechanicum serves as a cautionary tale that echoes across the millennia. It demonstrates that corruption does not require monstrous evil, but merely human weakness, pride, ambition, righteous anger, and the certainty that one's cause justifies any means. It shows that good intentions pave the road to hell as surely as malicious ones. It proves that knowledge without wisdom leads to disaster. Most importantly, it reveals that the greatest threats come not from obvious enemies but from ourselves, from the darkest potentials that lurk within even the most dedicated servants of humanity. The tech priests who became the Dark Mechanicum were not corrupted by external forces alone. They were corrupted by their own virtues taken to extremes, by their own principles followed past the point of sanity. That is the real horror of their fall, and that is why their story continues to matter 10,000 years after Mars burned.